The fluorescent lights of the old gas station flickered ominously as Daniel clocked in for another night shift. Located on a desolate stretch of highway, Harper's Gas and Convenience was a relic from another era, with its peeling paint and vintage pumps. It was the kind of place that felt untouched by time, where the nights stretched on interminably, punctuated only by the occasional customer and the relentless hum of the refrigeration units. Daniel had been working there for 6 months, a job he had taken out of necessity rather than choice. The hours were long and the pay meager, but it was a job and it kept him occupied. The other employees avoided the night shift, passing it off as too quiet, too lonely. But Daniel didn't mind the solitude until the strange occurrences began. It started with the sounds. At first, it was just a faint tapping, barely audible over the hum of the lights. Then it grew louder, more insistent, like someone or something trying to get his attention. He would check the security monitors, but they showed nothing but the empty lot and the dark highway beyond. He tried to dismiss it as the old building settling, but a nagging sense of unease settled in the back of his mind. One night, as Daniel was stocking shelves, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind him. He turned quickly, expecting to see a customer, but the store was empty. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end. He forced himself to continue working, but the feeling of being watched persisted. Around 2 a.m., a car pulled into the lot, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Daniel watched as a man got out and began pumping gas. The customer was tall, with a weathered face and dark eyes that seemed to glint unnervingly in the harsh lights. After a few minutes, the man came inside to pay. "Quiet night, huh?" the man said, his voice low and gravelly. "Yeah, pretty quiet," Daniel replied, forcing a smile. The man handed over a crumpled bill and some change. As Daniel rang up the transaction, the man leaned closer, his eyes boring into Daniel's. "You should be careful out here. Strange things happen on nights like this." Before Daniel could respond, the man turned and walked out, leaving him with a lingering sense of dread. He watched the car disappear into the darkness, the taillights fading until they were swallowed by the night. Daniel shook off the encounter and returned to his duties, but the man's words echoed in his mind. Strange things happen on nights like this. He tried to focus, but his thoughts kept drifting to the odd noises and the feeling of being watched. Around 3 a.m., the lights began to flicker again. Daniel cursed under his breath and went to the back room to check the breaker box. As he fumbled with the switches, he heard a faint whispering sound, like voices murmuring just out of earshot. He turned, but the room was empty. He returned to the front of the store, only to find the lights had gone out completely. The darkness was oppressive, the only illumination coming from the dim emergency lights. Daniel felt his way to the counter and grabbed a flashlight. As he clicked it on, the beam cut through the darkness, revealing the empty aisles and the reflections in the glass doors. He heard the footsteps again, this time louder, more distinct. They seemed to come from the back of the store. Heart pounding, Daniel followed the sound, his flashlight casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. The footsteps led him to the storage room, a place he rarely had to enter during his shift. He pushed the door open and stepped inside, the musty smell of old cardboard and cleaning supplies filling his nostrils. The footsteps stopped abruptly, leaving him in an oppressive silence. He swept the room with his flashlight, but saw nothing unusual. Just as he was about to turn back, he noticed something out of the corner of his eye, a small door he had never seen before, partially hidden behind a stack of boxes. Daniel's curiosity got the better of him. He moved the boxes aside and examined the door. It was old and warped, with a rusted handle. He hesitated for a moment, then grasped the handle and pulled. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. A cold draft wafted up from the stairs, carrying with it a faint metallic smell. Daniel hesitated, a sense of foreboding settling over him. He considered closing the door and pretending he had never seen it, but something compelled him to descend. He took a deep breath and started down the stairs, the flashlight beam flickering with each step. The air grew colder, the metallic smell stronger. At the bottom of the stairs, he found himself in a small, dimly lit room. The walls were lined with old, decaying photographs, their subjects staring out with hollow eyes. In the center of the room was an old wooden table, its surface stained dark. As Daniel approached the table, he saw an old leather-bound book lying open. The pages were yellowed with age, covered in a spidery script that he couldn't decipher. He reached out to touch the book, and a chill ran down his spine. The whispers returned, louder now, filling the room with their eerie cadence. He spun around, the flashlight beam revealing a figure standing in the doorway. It was the man from earlier, his eyes glinting in the dim light. "I warned you," the man said, his voice a raspy whisper. "You shouldn't have come down here." Before Daniel could react, the man lunged at him, and the room plunged into darkness. He felt cold hands grip his arms, pulling him down. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and the darkness closed in around him. When Daniel awoke, he was lying on the cold, hard floor of the storage room. The door was gone, the staircase vanished. He stumbled to his feet, his mind racing. He ran to the front of the store, the lights flickering back to life as he emerged. The clock on the wall read 4 a.m., but it felt as though he had been down there for hours. He tried to shake off the terror that clung to him, but the feeling of being watched remained. As the first light of dawn broke through the windows, Daniel made a decision. He couldn't stay there another night. He quit his job and left the gas station behind, hoping to escape the nightmares that had begun to plague him. But even after he left, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was following him. The whispers haunted his dreams, and the feeling of cold hands gripping his arms jolted him awake at night. He moved to a new town, started a new job, but the sense of dread never left him. One night, months later, as he walked home from work, he saw a familiar figure standing under a streetlight. It was the man from the gas station, his eyes glinting in the darkness. "You can't escape," the man whispered, his voice echoing in Daniel's mind. Daniel turned and ran, but the whispers followed, growing louder and more insistent. He knew then that he would never be free. The darkness had claimed him, and there was no escaping its grasp. And so, the gas station remained, a relic of forgotten nightmares, waiting for its next victim to wander in and uncover the horrors that lay hidden within its walls. And on quiet nights, when the wind howls and the darkness presses in, you can still hear the whispers of those who were lost, forever trapped in the shadows. The gas station was an old, run-down establishment on the edge of town, far enough from the main road that only the occasional traveler or local would stop by. Mark had been working the night shift for several months, finding comfort in the solitude and the steady hum of fluorescent lights. It was an easy job, stocking shelves, ringing up the rare customer, and cleaning up before dawn. But lately, the nights had grown increasingly unsettling. It started with small things, a shadow flickering at the edge of his vision, the faint sound of footsteps when he knew he was alone, and the oppressive silence that seemed to deepen as the hours crept by. Mark chalked it up to fatigue and the eerie nature of the night shift. But as the weeks passed, the incidents became harder to ignore. One particularly cold and quiet night, Mark was restocking the cooler when he heard the sound of someone shuffling across the floor. He poked his head out, expecting to see a customer, but the station was empty. The door hadn't chimed, and the security monitor showed no sign of movement. Unease settled in his stomach, but he shook it off and returned to his work. A few hours later, as he was mopping the floor, the lights began to flicker. The power surged, causing the ancient radio on the counter to crackle to life, playing a distorted old tune that sent shivers down Mark's spine. He unplugged it, but the static continued, filling the room with an unnerving buzz. He glanced at the clock. It was 3 a.m., the witching hour. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. As the night dragged on, Mark tried to distract himself with mundane tasks, but the feeling of being watched persisted. He decided to check the storage room, thinking maybe a stray animal had gotten inside. The room was dark and cluttered, filled with old boxes and forgotten supplies. As he searched, he found an old wooden trapdoor hidden beneath a pile of boxes. He had never noticed it before. Curiosity got the better of him, and he pried it open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. The air that wafted up was cold and musty, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and decay. Against his better judgment, Mark grabbed a flashlight and descended the stairs. The basement was a maze of narrow corridors and small rooms, filled with more old boxes and forgotten relics. The walls were covered in strange, faded symbols that seemed to pulse in the beam of his flashlight. As he ventured deeper, he heard faint whispers, just at the edge of his hearing. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, urgent and desperate. Mark's heart pounded as he followed the whispers to a small, windowless room at the far end of the basement. Inside, he found an old, rusted bed frame and a few scattered belongings. It looked like someone had been living there long ago. On the floor, partially hidden by debris, was a small, leather-bound journal. He picked it up, his hands trembling. The pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with cramped handwriting. The journal belonged to a man named Thomas, who had worked the night shift at the gas station decades earlier. As Mark read, he felt a growing sense of dread. Thomas wrote of strange occurrences, voices in the night, shadowy figures that moved just out of sight, and an overwhelming feeling of being watched. He described the basement in detail, mentioning the same symbols that Mark had seen. But the last few entries were the most disturbing. July 12, 1975. I can hear them again. The whispers are getting louder and I can't escape them. I tried to tell Mr. Harper, but he wouldn't listen. He said I was imagining things, but I know the truth. This place is cursed. There's something down here, something evil. July 14, 1975. They're coming for me. I can feel it. I haven't slept in days, and the shadows are closing in. If anyone finds this journal, leave this place. Burn it down. Don't let it consume you like it did me. Mark's blood ran cold. He slammed the journal shut and turned to leave, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The flashlight flickered and died, plunging him into darkness. He stumbled back up the stairs, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The basement door slammed shut behind him with a deafening crash. Back in the main store, the lights continued to flicker. The radio crackled to life again, the distorted music now accompanied by a faint, chilling laughter. Mark backed away, his eyes darting around the room. He could feel the presence now, a cold, suffocating force that seemed to press in from all sides. Desperate, he grabbed his keys and ran for the door, but it wouldn't budge. The windows were dark, the outside world obscured by a thick, unnatural fog. The whispers grew louder, echoing through the store, merging into a cacophony of voices. In the reflection of the store window, Mark saw them. Shadowy figures with hollow eyes watching him, their mouths moving in silent screams. The temperature dropped, and his breath fogged the glass. He turned to face them. His back against the door, and they moved closer, their forms flickering in and out of existence. He felt a cold hand grip his shoulder, and he screamed, the sound echoing through the empty store. The last thing he saw before the darkness consumed him was the reflection of his own terrified face, surrounded by the ghostly figures that had haunted him. When the morning shift worker arrived, they found the gas station empty. The lights were off, the store in disarray. There was no sign of Mark, except for the journal left on the counter, open to the last desperate entry. The words were smeared, as if written in haste. July 15, 1975. They're here. Don't stay. Don't listen to the whispers. The worker called the police, but the investigation turned up nothing. Mark was declared missing, and the gas station was eventually abandoned, left to decay. Locals whispered of the cursed place, warning others to stay away. And on dark, stormy nights, those who ventured too close swore they could still hear the whispers of the lost souls echoing through the empty gas station, forever trapped in the darkness. The rain poured down in torrents, the kind of relentless downpour that made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Jenna squinted through the windshield, her knuckles white as she gripped the steering wheel. She had been driving for hours, trying to get home before the storm hit, but now she was caught in its fury. The GPS signal had been lost miles back, and she felt hopelessly lost in the labyrinth of back roads and endless forest. Just when she thought things couldn't get worse, the engine sputtered and died. The car rolled to a stop, and Jenna let out a frustrated sigh. She tried the ignition, but it was no use. The car was dead. She sat there for a moment, letting the reality of her situation sink in. She was stranded in the middle of nowhere, with no cell service and a storm raging outside. As she pondered her next move, she noticed a faint glow through the sheets of rain, a neon sign flickering in the distance. It was an old gas station, its lights barely cutting through the darkness. Jenna grabbed her raincoat and flashlight, bracing herself against the wind and rain as she made her way toward the station. The gas station was dilapidated, its windows boarded up and the paint peeling off in large chunks. The sign above the entrance flickered ominously, "Harper's Gas and Service." Jenna tried the door, and to her surprise, it creaked open. She stepped inside, grateful to be out of the rain, but the air inside was musty and stale. She shone her flashlight around the room, revealing dusty shelves stocked with ancient, expired products. The place had clearly been abandoned for years. The only sound was the steady drumming of rain on the roof and the occasional creak of the building settling. "Hello?" she called out, her voice echoing in the empty space. There was no response. She felt a shiver run down her spine, but she pushed the feeling aside. She needed to find a phone or some way to contact help. Jenna moved deeper into the gas station, her flashlight beam dancing over the worn linoleum floor. She found a door marked "Office" and pushed it open. The room beyond was small and cluttered, with an old desk and a rotary phone sitting atop it. She picked up the phone, but there was no dial tone. Frustrated, she slammed it down. As she turned to leave, she noticed a door slightly ajar at the back of the office. She pushed it open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. The air wafting up from the basement was cold and damp, carrying with it a faint metallic smell. Something told her to turn back, but curiosity and desperation drove her forward. She descended the stairs cautiously, her flashlight revealing cobwebs and damp concrete walls. At the bottom, she found herself in a large, open space filled with old machinery and discarded junk. As she explored the basement, her flashlight flickered and went out. She cursed under her breath, smacking it against her palm until the light sputtered back to life. When the beam returned, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. A door at the far end of the room, slightly ajar, with a faint light spilling out. Jenna approached the door, her heart pounding in her chest. She pushed it open and stepped inside, the light from a single, naked bulb revealing a makeshift living space. There was a cot in one corner, a small table with a few personal items, and a wall covered in newspaper clippings. She moved closer, her eyes scanning the headlines: "Local girl missing, disappearance mystery deepens, no leads in missing persons case." The clippings were old, yellowed with age, and as Jenna read them, a sense of unease settled over her. She felt like she was being watched. A sudden creak behind her made her spin around, her flashlight beam catching a glimpse of movement. A figure stepped out of the shadows, and Jenna's heart leapt into her throat. It was an old man, his face gaunt and eyes hollow. He looked at her with a mixture of surprise and anger. "What are you doing here?" he rasped, his voice echoing in the confined space. I was just looking for help," Jenna stammered. "My car broke down, and I saw the lights." The man's expression softened slightly, but there was still a coldness in his eyes. "This place is dangerous. You shouldn't be here." Jenna took a step back, her mind racing. "Who are you?" The man hesitated, then sighed. "My name is Harold. I used to run this station years ago, but things happened. Bad things." Jenna's curiosity got the better of her fear. What happened here? Harold's gaze shifted to the wall of clippings. People started disappearing. It started with a little girl, then more followed. The police searched, but they never found anything. The station closed, but I stayed. I had to stay. Jenna felt a chill run down her spine. "Why did you stay?" Harold's eyes bore into hers. "Because the station is cursed. Once you step foot here, it doesn't let you leave." Jenna shook her head, refusing to believe it. "That's ridiculous. I'm leaving right now." Harold reached out, grabbing her arm with surprising strength. "No, you don't understand. It feeds on fear. The more you try to leave, the stronger it gets." Jenna wrenched her arm free and ran up the stairs, her heart pounding. She burst out of the office and into the rain, but her relief was short-lived. The gas station seemed to loom larger, the darkness around it pressing in like a living thing. She ran to her car, but it was dead, the hood open and the engine exposed. She hadn't left it that way. Panic set in as she realized she was trapped. She turned back to the gas station, and there, standing in the doorway, was Harold. "I told you," he said, his voice carrying over the wind and rain. "It doesn't let you leave." Jenna screamed in frustration and terror, her voice lost in the storm. She fell to her knees, the rain soaking her to the bone, and looked up at the gas station, its windows glowing with a sinister light. As the hours passed, the rain slowed to a drizzle, and the first light of dawn broke through the clouds. But for Jenna, there was no escape. She remained on her knees, staring at the gas station, her mind unraveling. Harold watched from the doorway, his expression one of sorrow and resignation. "Welcome to Harper's Gas and Service," he said softly. "You're one of us now." And so Jenna joined the ranks of those who had come before her, lost to the darkness of the abandoned gas station, forever trapped in its grip. The rain washed away her tears, but not the terror that had taken root in her heart. The gas station stood silent and still, a dark presence on the edge of the forest, waiting for its next victim. The gas station was eerily quiet as Ethan prepared for closing. The night shift at Harper's Gas and Convenience was usually uneventful, with only the occasional late-night traveler stopping by for fuel or a snack. Tonight, however, there was an unsettling stillness in the air, and the dim, fluorescent lights cast long, flickering shadows that seemed to dance on their own. Ethan glanced at the clock on the wall. 11:45 p.m. Only 15 more minutes until he could lock up and head home. He started his nightly routine, wiping down the counters and restocking the shelves. Outside, the wind howled, and the trees along the highway swayed like dark sentinels. As he moved to the front counter to organize the register, he noticed a faint, rhythmic tapping sound coming from outside. He paused, listening intently. The tapping continued, growing louder and more insistent. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. He peered out the window, but the darkness beyond the glow of the gas station's lights revealed nothing. Just as he was about to dismiss it as a trick of the wind, the bell above the door chimed, signaling a customer. Ethan looked up and froze. Standing in the doorway was a girl, no older than 12, her clothes soaked and her hair matted with rain. She looked like she had walked straight out of a nightmare. "Can I help you?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling slightly. The girl stepped inside, her eyes wide and filled with a mixture of fear and confusion. "I'm lost," she whispered. "Can you help me find my parents?" Ethan's heart ached at the sight of her. He walked around the counter and knelt down to her level. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Alice," she replied, her voice barely audible. "Okay, Alice, let's see if we can call your parents. Do you know their phone number?" Alice shook her head, her eyes welling up with tears. Ethan led her to a chair behind the counter and handed her a towel to dry off. He picked up the phone and called the local police, explaining the situation. The dispatcher promised to send an officer right away. While they waited, Ethan tried to make Alice comfortable, offering her a cup of hot chocolate from the station's ancient coffee machine. She took it with trembling hands, her gaze fixed on the door as if expecting someone, or something, to come through at any moment. The minutes dragged on, and Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He noticed bruises on Alice's arms and legs, partially hidden by her wet clothes. "Alice, what happened to you?" He asked gently. She looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. "I don't remember. I was with my parents, and then..." Darkness. "I woke up in the woods, and I ran here." Ethan's stomach churned. The bell above the door chimed again, and he looked up, expecting to see the police. Instead, a man in a dark coat stood there, his face obscured by the shadow of his hat. "Is everything all right here?" the man asked, his voice low and cold. Ethan stood protectively in front of Alice. "We're fine, just waiting for the police. This girl is lost and needs help." The man stepped forward and the air grew colder. "I'll take care of her. She belongs to me." Alice's grip tightened on Ethan's arm. "No," she cried. "Please don't let him take me." Ethan's heart pounded. He reached for the baseball bat he kept under the counter for emergencies. "You need to leave now," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. The man laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. "You don't understand, do you? She's mine. She was taken from me, and I will have her back." The lights flickered and Ethan felt an oppressive weight in the air. The man took another step forward, and the darkness seemed to thicken around him. Ethan swung the bat, but it passed through the man as if he were made of smoke. The man lunged, and Ethan felt a cold, sharp pain as darkness engulfed him. When he opened his eyes, the gas station was silent and empty. Alice was gone, and the only sign of the struggle was the overturned chair and the spilled hot chocolate. Ethan stumbled to the phone and dialed the police again, his hands shaking uncontrollably. The police arrived within minutes, but there was little they could do. There was no trace of Alice, no sign of the man, and no evidence of what had transpired. The security cameras had malfunctioned, capturing only static. Ethan was questioned and eventually released, but he couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over him. He returned to the gas station the next night, unable to stay away. As the clock neared midnight, he heard the faint, rhythmic tapping again. This time, he didn't look up when the bell chimed. He knew who it would be. "Alice?" he whispered, his voice trembling. The girl stepped inside, her clothes soaked and her hair matted with rain. She looked at him with those same wide, fearful eyes. "I'm lost," she whispered. "Can you help me find my parents?" Ethan nodded, tears streaming down his face. He knew he was trapped in a nightmare that would never end. Each night, the same events would unfold, and each night he would fail to protect her. As the darkness closed in around him, Ethan realized that some horrors are inescapable, and some souls are forever bound to the shadows. The summer was winding down when Jake and Tyler decided to go on one last adventure before the new school year began. Both in their early 20s, they had been best friends since childhood and often reminisced about their road trips together, filled with laughter, mischief, and the freedom of the open road. This year, they planned to visit a series of ghost towns scattered across the Midwest, a trip that promised both excitement and a touch of the eerie. Their car, an old but reliable Jeep, was packed with camping gear, snacks, and a collection of maps and guidebooks. They set off early one morning, the rising sun casting long shadows on the empty highway. The first few towns they visited were fascinating, each one a snapshot of history frozen in time. They explored dilapidated buildings, snapped photos, and imagined what life had been like for the people who once lived there. On the third day of their trip, they decided to visit a town called Black Hollow. It wasn't on most maps, but Tyler had read about it in an obscure book on haunted places. According to the book, Black Hollow had been abandoned almost overnight in the 1920s, and few people knew why. The prospect of discovering such a mysterious place excited them both. The journey to Black Hollow took them off the main roads and deep into the countryside. As they drove, the scenery became increasingly desolate, with fields giving way to thick forests. The GPS lost signal, and they had to rely on Tyler's navigational skills and the old map he had found. By late afternoon, they arrived at what appeared to be the outskirts of Black Hollow. The air felt heavier here, and an uneasy silence hung over the place. The town was shrouded in mist, the sun struggling to pierce through the thick canopy of trees that surrounded it. The buildings, though largely intact, had an air of neglect and decay. "Creepy, huh?" Tyler said, grinning. Jake nodded, though he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. They parked the Jeep and began to explore. The main street was lined with old storefronts, their windows cracked and dusty. An abandoned church stood at one end, its steeple leaning precariously. As they wandered through the town, they noticed that there were no birds, no insects, not even the rustle of leaves. It was as if the town existed in a vacuum, cut off from the world. "Let's check out the church," Jake suggested, his voice unnaturally loud in the stillness. They made their way inside, the wooden doors creaking ominously. The interior was dim, with light filtering through stained glass windows. Pews were overturned, and a thick layer of dust covered everything. At the front of the church, the pulpit stood silent, a Bible open to a page that had yellowed with age. Tyler walked up to the pulpit and picked up the Bible. "Look at this," he said, showing Jake a passage that had been underlined. "And the darkness shall consume them, and they shall know despair." A shiver ran down Jake's spine. "Let's keep looking around." They left the church and continued exploring, finding an old schoolhouse, a general store, and several homes, all abandoned and in various states of decay. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the town, they decided to set up camp near the town square. They built a small fire and sat around it, the crackling flames providing a comforting contrast to the growing darkness. They talked and laughed, but the eerie silence of Black Hollow never quite left their minds. As the night wore on, they began to hear faint noises. At first, it was just the wind rustling through the trees, but then they heard whispers, too low to make out the words. The firelight flickered, casting dancing shadows on the surrounding buildings. "Did you hear that?" Jake asked, his eyes wide. "Yeah," Tyler replied, his voice tense. "Probably just the wind." But the whispers grew louder and the shadows seemed to move of their own accord. The friends stood up, their eyes darting around nervously. "We should check it out," Tyler said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. Reluctantly, they grabbed their flashlights and began to follow the sound. It led them to the edge of town, near an old, dilapidated house. The front door was ajar, and the whispers seemed to be coming from inside. "Do we really want to go in there?" Jake asked, his heart pounding. Tyler nodded. "We've come this far." They pushed the door open and stepped inside. The house was dark, the air thick with dust and decay. Their flashlights cut through the gloom, revealing broken furniture and peeling wallpaper. The whispers were louder now, echoing through the empty rooms. As they moved deeper into the house, they found a staircase leading to the basement. The whispers seemed to be coming from below. "Let's do this," Tyler said, though his voice was barely above a whisper. They descended the stairs, the wooden steps creaking under their weight. At the bottom, they found themselves in a large, empty room. The whispers were all around them now, unintelligible but filled with a sense of urgency. Suddenly, the door at the top of the stairs slammed shut, plunging them into darkness. Their flashlights flickered and died, leaving them in complete blackness. Panic set in, and they stumbled around, trying to find their way back up the stairs. Then they saw it, a faint, glowing figure in the corner of the room. It was a woman, her eyes hollow and her face twisted in sorrow. She reached out to them, her mouth moving as if trying to speak, but the whispers drowned out her words. Jake and Tyler backed away, their hearts racing. The figure moved closer, and they felt a cold, suffocating presence enveloping them. They tried to scream, but no sound came out. The next morning, the town of Oak Ridge was quiet, as always. The locals went about their day, unaware of the horrors that had unfolded in Black Hollow. Days turned into weeks, and the Bennett family grew worried when Jake and Tyler didn't return home. A search party was organized, but they found no trace of the friends. The Jeep was still parked at the edge of Black Hollow, but the town itself seemed untouched, as if it had swallowed them whole. Months later, a hiker passing through the area decided to explore the abandoned town. As he wandered through the streets, he felt an inexplicable sense of dread. In the basement of the old house, he found a flashlight and a camera, both covered in dust. Curious, he took the camera and left the town, eager to see if it held any clues. When he developed the film, he found a series of photographs showing Jake and Tyler smiling and carefree as they explored Black Hollow. But the last photo was different. It showed the two friends standing in the basement, their faces frozen in terror as a faint, glowing figure loomed behind them. The hiker felt a chill run down his spine as he realized what had happened. The whispers of Black Hollow had claimed 2 more victims, and the town's dark secret remained hidden, waiting for the next unsuspecting travelers to wander into its grasp. The old Victorian house on the outskirts of town had always held a certain charm for the Thompsons. With its grand architecture, sprawling gardens, and rich history, it seemed the perfect place to raise their 2 children, Lily and Ben. They moved in during the fall, the air crisp with the promise of new beginnings. The house was everything they had dreamed of, but it wasn't long before strange things began to happen. It started with the noises, soft, almost imperceptible whispers that seemed to come from the walls. At first, the Thompsons dismissed them as the creaks and groans of an old house settling, But the sounds grew more frequent and more unsettling. One night, Mary Thompson woke to the sound of laughter. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding. The laughter was light and playful, but there was something unnerving about it. She glanced at her husband, Tom, who was still sound asleep, then slipped out of bed to investigate. The laughter seemed to be coming from the basement. Mary hesitated at the top of the stairs, a chill running down her spine. Taking a deep breath, she descended the creaky steps. The basement was cold and dark, the air thick with the smell of damp earth. She turned on the light, casting eerie shadows on the stone walls. There, in the middle of the basement, stood Lily. Her back was to Mary, and she was giggling softly, her shoulders shaking with mirth. "Lily?" Mary called softly, stepping closer. Lily turned slowly, her eyes wide and unseeing, her laughter dying on her lips. Mary realized with a jolt that her daughter was sleepwalking. She had never done that before. Gently, Mary guided Lily back to bed, her mind racing with questions. The next morning, Mary told Tom about the incident. He brushed it off, saying that children sometimes sleepwalk and that it was nothing to worry about. But Mary couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As the weeks passed, Lily's sleepwalking episodes became more frequent. Each time, Mary would find her in the basement, standing in the same spot, laughing softly. And each time, it became harder to wake her. Mary began to dread the nights, fearing what she might find. One evening, as the family gathered for dinner, Mary noticed that Lily seemed unusually quiet. Her eyes were distant, and she picked at her food without interest. "Lily, are you feeling okay?" Mary asked, concerned. Lily looked up, her expression blank. "They want to play with me." Mary's blood ran cold. "Who wants to play with you, sweetie?" Lily's gaze shifted to the basement door, and she said nothing more. That night, Mary couldn't sleep. She lay awake, listening to the sounds of the house, every creak and whisper magnified in the silence. Around midnight, she heard the laughter again. This time, it was louder, more insistent. She got out of bed and quietly opened the door to Lily's room. As she feared, the bed was empty. Mary hurried to the basement, her heart pounding. She found Lily in the same spot, but this time, she wasn't alone. Ben was standing next to her, his eyes wide and vacant, echoing Lily's eerie laughter. "Ben, Lily, come on, let's get you back to bed," Mary said, her voice trembling. As she reached out to touch them, both children turned to look at her, their faces twisted into strange, unsettling smiles. Mary gasped and stepped back, a wave of nausea washing over her. It was as if her children were no longer themselves. Suddenly, the basement light flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. Mary felt a cold hand grip her arm, and she screamed. The laughter grew louder, echoing around her, filling the space with a cacophony of eerie mirth. Tom rushed down the stairs, flashlight in hand. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing Mary standing alone in the basement, her eyes wide with terror. The children were gone. "Mary, what's going on?" Tom demanded, his voice shaking. "They were here," Mary whispered. "Lily and Ben, they were here laughing, but now they're gone." Tom searched the basement, but there was no sign of the children. They checked the entire house, calling their names, but there was no response. Panic set in, and they called the police. A search was organized, but Lily and Ben were nowhere to be found. Days turned into weeks, and the Thompsons were consumed by grief and fear. The whispers in the house grew louder, more insistent. Mary spent her nights pacing the hallways, unable to sleep, haunted by the laughter that still echoed in her mind. One night, as she wandered the house, she heard a familiar sound, the soft giggle of a child. She followed it to the basement, her heart pounding with a mix of hope and dread. As she descended the stairs, she saw them, Lily and Ben, standing in the same spot, their eyes wide and vacant. "Mommy, come play with us," Lily said, her voice hollow. Mary reached out, but the children backed away, their laughter growing louder. She felt a cold presence behind her and turned to see a shadowy figure looming in the darkness. Its eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, and its mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. "Come play with us," it whispered, its voice a chorus of the lost. Mary screamed, but no sound came out. The darkness closed in around her, the laughter ringing in her ears. She felt herself being pulled into the void, her mind unraveling with terror. The next morning, Tom found Mary in the basement, her eyes wide and lifeless, her face frozen in a twisted smile. The children were still missing, their laughter echoing faintly in the empty house. The Thompsons' once idyllic home was left abandoned, a dark presence lingering within its walls. The townspeople spoke of the house in hushed tones, warning others to stay away. And on quiet nights, if you stood outside and listened closely, you could still hear the laughter of the lost children, forever trapped in the darkness. In the small, unassuming town of Whispering Pines, the Henderson family was known for their idyllic life. Their house, a charming colonial with white shutters and a wraparound porch, sat at the end of Maple Lane, surrounded by lush trees and vibrant gardens. It was the picture of tranquility, and the Hendersons, Robert, Laura, and their teenage daughter Emily, seemed to lead a perfect existence. However, the town harbored a dark secret, one that would soon unravel the fabric of their lives. It began one summer evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the quiet streets. Emily was in her room, idly flipping through a book, when she heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails drumming on wood. She dismissed it at first, attributing it to the old house settling or a branch brushing against the window. But the tapping persisted, growing louder and more insistent. Curiosity piqued, Emily set her book aside and listened intently. The sound seemed to be coming from the attic. She had always found the attic a bit unsettling, with its dusty boxes and forgotten relics from generations past. Steeling herself, she grabbed a flashlight and made her way up the narrow staircase. The attic was dimly lit by the fading light filtering through a small, grimy window. Dust motes danced in the beam of her flashlight as she swept it across the room. The tapping continued, drawing her attention to an old trunk in the far corner. She approached it cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. The trunk was covered in a thick layer of dust, its brass fittings tarnished with age. Emily hesitated, then slowly lifted the lid. Inside, she found an assortment of old photographs, letters, and a small, ornate box. The box was intricately carved, with strange symbols that seemed to pulse in the dim light. She felt a chill run down her spine as she reached out to touch it. The moment her fingers brushed the surface, the tapping stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. Emily opened the box, revealing a delicate silver locket. She picked it up, examining the intricate design. Inside, she found a tiny portrait of a young girl, her eyes hauntingly familiar. As she stared at the locket, a whispering voice filled the attic, barely audible but unmistakably real. "Help me," the voice pleaded, sending a shiver down Emily's spine. She dropped the locket, her heart racing. The attic seemed to close in around her, the shadows growing darker and more menacing. She fled down the stairs, desperate to escape the unsettling presence. She tried to tell her parents about what she had found, but they dismissed her concerns, attributing it to an overactive imagination. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, listening to the house creak and groan. The whispering returned, faint and persistent, echoing through her mind. She covered her ears, but the voice seemed to come from within her own thoughts. "Help me." The following days were filled with a growing sense of dread. Emily's parents noticed her unease but attributed it to typical teenage angst. They were too busy with their own lives to pay much attention. But the whispering continued, and Emily's dreams were plagued by visions of the girl in the locket, trapped in a dark, suffocating space. Desperate for answers, Emily returned to the attic. She searched through the trunk, hoping to find some clue about the girl's identity. Among the letters and photographs, she found a diary, its pages yellowed with age. The diary belonged to a girl named Annabelle, who had lived in the house over a century ago. As Emily read the diary, a chilling story began to unfold. Annabelle had been a lonely child, neglected by her parents and tormented by an older brother. She wrote of strange occurrences in the house, objects moving on their own, whispering voices, and a sense of being watched. The entries grew darker, filled with fear and desperation. June 5th, 1902. I found the locket today. It was hidden in the attic, in a box covered with strange symbols. I feel like someone is watching me. The whispering never stops. I don't know what to do. June 15th, 1902. My brother found the locket. He says it's cursed. He locked me in the attic and I can't get out. The whispering is louder now. I think I'm losing my mind. Emily's hands trembled as she read the final entry. June 20th, 1902. I'm so scared. The whispering won't stop. I feel like something is coming for me. I don't want to die. Emily realized with a start that Annabelle had died in the attic, alone and terrified. Her spirit had been trapped there, bound to the locket. The whispers were her cries for help, echoing through the decades. Emily knew she had to do something to free Annabelle's spirit. She decided to perform a cleansing ritual she had read about online. That night, after her parents had gone to bed, she gathered candles, salt, and a small bundle of sage. She climbed the stairs to the attic, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. As she entered the attic, the air grew colder and the whispering intensified. She lit the candles, placing them in a circle around the trunk. She sprinkled salt around the circle, creating a protective barrier. With trembling hands, she lit the sage and began to recite the cleansing ritual. Spirits bound by sorrow and pain, I call upon the light to break your chain. Be released from this place. Find peace and leave no trace. The attic seemed to tremble as she spoke, the shadows twisting and writhing. The whispering grew louder, a cacophony of voices pleading for release. Emily continued the ritual, her voice growing stronger with each word. Annabelle, your suffering ends tonight. Find the light and take flight. Be free from this earthly pain and never be bound again. The candles flickered and a cold wind swept through the attic, extinguishing the flames. For a moment there was only silence. Then, a soft, glowing light emerged from the locket, illuminating the attic with a warm golden hue. The light grew brighter, and Emily felt a sense of peace wash over her. The light faded, and the attic returned to its normal state. The oppressive presence was gone, and the whispering had ceased. Emily knew that Annabelle's spirit had finally found peace. She closed the locket and placed it back in the ornate box, feeling a sense of closure. The next morning, Emily told her parents what had happened. They were skeptical at first, but couldn't deny the change in their daughter. She seemed lighter, happier, as if a great burden had been lifted from her shoulders. Life in the Henderson house returned to normal, and the dark presence that had haunted Emily's dreams was gone. But as the years passed, Emily never forgot Annabelle's story. She made sure to keep the locket safe, a reminder of the girl who had been trapped in darkness for so long. However, not all stories have happy endings. One night, many years later, Emily returned to the attic to retrieve an old family photo album. As she rummaged through the trunk, she noticed the ornate box lying forgotten in a corner. Curiosity getting the better of her, she opened it and found the locket, still as beautiful and haunting as ever. As she held it in her hand, a cold draft swept through the attic, and she heard it, the faintest whisper, echoing from the past. Help me. Emily's heart sank. She realized that some spirits could never truly be at peace, and the darkness that had haunted Annabelle was still lurking, waiting for its next victim. The town of Blackwood had always been shrouded in an eerie mist, both literal and figurative. Nestled in a valley surrounded by dense forests, the town was known for its haunting beauty and unsettling history. Blackwood High School stood at the heart of this enigmatic town, its old brick walls and towering clock tower casting long shadows over the surrounding streets. For years, Blackwood High had been the epicenter of local legends and ghost stories. Tales of students who had vanished without a trace, their spirits said to haunt the school's labyrinthine corridors, were whispered among the townspeople. Most dismissed these stories as mere folklore, but a shadow of fear always lingered. It was the start of the new school year, and the air was thick with anticipation. Among the incoming freshmen was a boy named Alex, a quiet, introspective teenager who had moved to Blackwood with his family over the summer. He had heard the stories, but like most, he didn't believe in ghosts. To him, Blackwood High was just another school, a place to make new friends and start anew. The first few weeks passed uneventfully. Alex quickly settled into his routine, making a few friends and keeping up with his studies. However, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the school. The corridors seemed to stretch on forever, and there were times when he felt an inexplicable chill, as if unseen eyes were watching him. One evening, after a long day of classes and extracurricular activities, Alex stayed late to work on a project in the library. The sun had set and the school was eerily quiet. As he gathered his books and prepared to leave, he heard footsteps echoing down the empty hallway. He glanced at his watch. It was well past closing time. "Hello?" he called out, his voice reverberating through the silence. There was no response. Curiosity getting the better of him, Alex decided to investigate. He followed the sound of the footsteps, his own footsteps echoing in tandem. The noise led him deeper into the school, down corridors he had never seen before. The walls seemed to close in on him, and the dim lighting cast long, flickering shadows. As he turned a corner, he caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of his eye. He stopped, his heart pounding in his chest. There, at the far end of the hallway, stood a girl about his age. She was dressed in old-fashioned clothes, her face pale and eyes hollow. She stared at him for a moment, then turned and disappeared around the corner. "Wait!" Alex called out, breaking into a run. He rounded the corner, but found the hallway empty. The air was cold, and he could see his breath in the dim light. Feeling unnerved, Alex decided to leave. He retraced his steps, but the corridor seemed unfamiliar. He realized with growing panic that he was lost. The school's layout had become a twisted maze, and the shadows seemed to move on their own. As he wandered the darkened halls, he heard whispers, soft, urgent voices that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The voices grew louder, more insistent, and he could make out fragments of conversations. "Where are we? Help us. We're trapped." Alex's fear turned to dread as he recognized the names being whispered, names of students who had vanished over the years. He tried to block out the voices, but they grew louder, more desperate. He turned a corner and froze. Standing before him were a group of children, their faces pale and eyes empty. They stared at him with a mixture of sorrow and longing. "Please help us," one of them whispered, her voice barely audible. Alex took a step back, his mind racing. "Who are you?" "We are the lost," the girl replied, "trapped here, unable to leave." He felt a chill run down his spine. The stories were true. The missing students were trapped within the school, their spirits unable to find peace. "How can I help you?" he asked, his voice trembling. The girl pointed to a door at the end of the hallway. "Find the key. Free us." With a sense of purpose, Alex walked towards the door. The whispers followed him, urging him on. He opened the door and found himself in a small, dusty room. At the center of the room was a desk, and on the desk lay an old, rusted key. He grabbed the key and turned to leave, but the door slammed shut, trapping him inside. The whispers grew louder, filling the room with their eerie cadence. The air grew cold, and the shadows seemed to close in around him. Desperate, he tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The room began to spin, and he felt a cold hand grip his shoulder. He turned and saw the girl standing behind him, her eyes filled with sorrow. "You can't leave," she whispered. "You're one of us now." The room went dark, and Alex felt himself being pulled into the shadows. The last thing he heard was the sound of his own voice, joining the chorus of whispers that echoed through the school. The next morning, the halls of Blackwood High were filled with the usual bustle of students and teachers. But among them, whispers of a new legend began to spread. A boy named Alex who had vanished without a trace, his spirit now wandering the corridors, searching for a way out. The school remained a place of mystery and fear, its walls holding the secrets of the lost. And on quiet nights, if you listened closely, you could still hear the whispers of the trapped souls, forever calling out for help in the darkened halls of Blackwood High. It was a chilly autumn night when Sarah first realized she had a problem. She woke up in her living room, the television flickering static and the front door wide open. Her bare feet were muddy, and her nightgown was damp with morning dew. She had no recollection of leaving her bed. Just a dream, she told herself, but she couldn't shake the eerie feeling that something was terribly wrong. Over the next few weeks, her nocturnal wanderings became more frequent. She would wake up in different parts of the house, the kitchen, the backyard, even the garage. Each time, she had no memory of how she got there. Her husband, Mark, grew increasingly concerned. "You were standing at the foot of the bed last night," he said one morning, his face pale. just staring at me with this blank look on your face. It was creepy, Sarah. Sarah decided it was time to see a doctor. The specialist diagnosed her with somnambulism, sleepwalking, and recommended some lifestyle changes and medications to help manage the condition. For a while, it seemed to work. Her sleepwalking episodes decreased, and she began to feel more in control. Then came the night that changed everything. Sarah awoke to the sound of crickets and the rustling of leaves. She was standing in the middle of a field, the full moon casting an eerie glow over the landscape. Panic surged through her as she looked around, trying to get her bearings. In the distance, she saw the silhouette of an old barn, its weathered wood and sagging roof giving it a foreboding appearance. With no other landmarks in sight, she decided to head towards the barn. The tall grass brushed against her legs as she walked, the cold night air chilling her to the bone. As she approached the barn, she noticed that the door was slightly ajar, creaking softly in the wind. Sarah hesitated at the entrance, her instincts screaming at her to turn back. But curiosity and a desperate need for shelter pushed her forward. She stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under her weight. The air was thick with the smell of mold and decay. She found an old lantern hanging from a nail on the wall and fumbled for a match in her pocket. She struck the match and lit the lantern, the dim light revealing the barn's contents: rusted farming tools, decaying hay bales, and animal bones scattered across the floor. As she moved deeper into the barn, she felt a growing sense of unease. The shadows seemed to move on their own, and she could hear faint whispers that sent shivers down her spine. She found a dusty old journal on a wooden workbench and, driven by a mix of fear and curiosity, began to read. The journal belonged to a man named Elijah, who had lived on the farm decades ago. His entries started off mundane, detailing daily chores and life in the countryside. But as she turned the pages, the tone grew darker. June 5th, 1937. Something is wrong. I hear noises at night, whispers that seem to come from the walls. Mary says it's just the wind, but I know better. There's something in the barn. July 12th, 1937. Mary is gone. I woke up and she wasn't in bed. I found her in the barn, staring at the loft, her eyes vacant. She won't speak, won't move. The doctor says it's a catatonic state, but I know it's the barn. It's taken her. August 20th, 1937. I hear them too now. The whispers, they're getting louder. I fear I will end up like Mary. The barn is cursed. I must end this. The last entry was dated September 1st, 1937. There was no mention of what Elijah had planned, no explanation of what had happened next. Sarah closed the journal, her hands shaking. She felt a cold breeze behind her and turned to see the loft above, the source of Elijah's torment. The whispers grew louder, echoing in her mind. She climbed the ladder to the loft, each step filling her with dread. At the top, she found a small makeshift bed and a worn-out doll. The air was colder here, and the shadows seemed to press in around her. Suddenly, she felt a presence behind her. She turned to see a figure standing at the edge of the loft, barely visible in the dim light. It was a woman, her eyes vacant and lifeless, her mouth moving as if whispering some dark secret. Sarah realized with a jolt that it was Mary. The figure stepped closer, the whispers growing deafening. Sarah tried to back away, but her feet seemed rooted to the spot. The shadows closed in and she felt an icy grip around her wrists, pulling her towards the edge of the loft. "No," she whispered, struggling against the unseen force. "Please, no." The figure's face twisted into a grotesque smile, and the whispers turned into mocking laughter. Sarah felt herself being pushed towards the edge, the floor disappearing beneath her. She screamed, the sound echoing in the dark void below. When she hit the ground, everything went black. Sarah awoke in a hospital bed, her body aching and her mind foggy. Mark was sitting beside her, his eyes red from sleepless nights and worry. "You're awake," he said, relief flooding his voice. "Thank God." "What happened?" she asked, her voice weak. "You were missing for 3 days," he said. "They found you in an old barn, unconscious. The doctors say you fell from the loft, but they can't explain the other injuries." "Other injuries?" she asked, confused. Mark hesitated, then showed her a mirror. Her wrists were bruised as if they had been gripped by iron shackles, and strange, jagged cuts covered her arms and legs. "The doctors think you might have done this to yourself," he said, his voice trembling. "But I know you, Sarah. I know you wouldn't." Tears filled her eyes as memories of the barn flooded back. The whispers, the figure, the dark presence that had dragged her to the edge. She knew that whatever had haunted Elijah and Mary was still there, still lurking in the shadows. As she recovered in the hospital, she couldn't escape the feeling of being watched. The whispers followed her, growing louder at night, filling her dreams with nightmares of the barn and the figure in the loft. One night, she woke to find herself standing at the hospital window, staring out into the darkness. Her wrists throbbed with pain, and she could hear the whispers calling her back, urging her to return to the barn. She knew then that the curse of the barn had followed her, that she would never be free. The darkness had taken hold of her, just as it had taken Elijah and Mary. And as the days turned into weeks, Sarah's will to fight the whispers waned. She knew it was only a matter of time before she would return to the barn, to the place where the darkness waited, hungry for her soul. And when she did, there would be no escape. Tom had always known that his wife, Lisa, had a history of sleepwalking. Ever since they got married, he'd occasionally find her wandering around the house in the middle of the night, eyes open but clearly not awake. Usually, it was harmless. She would simply walk to the living room, sit on the couch for a while, and then return to bed. But recently, her sleepwalking had taken a darker turn. It started subtly enough. Tom would wake up to the sound of creaking floorboards and find Lisa standing in the kitchen, staring out the window into the night. He would gently guide her back to bed, and she'd have no memory of it the next morning. But over the past few weeks, her nocturnal wanderings had become more frequent and more unsettling. One night, Tom awoke to the sound of clattering dishes. He rubbed his eyes and glanced at the clock, 3:12 a.m. With a sigh, he got out of bed and made his way to the kitchen, expecting to find Lisa in her usual daze. But as he approached the kitchen, he felt a chill run down his spine. Lisa was standing in front of the sink, her back to him. In her right hand, she held a large kitchen knife. The blade glinted in the dim light, and Tom's heart skipped a beat. He had never seen her pick up anything while sleepwalking before, let alone something as dangerous as a knife. "Lisa?" he called softly, trying not to startle her. She didn't respond. Instead, she continued to stare out the window, her grip on the knife tightening. Tom swallowed hard and took a step closer. "Lisa, honey, it's time to go back to bed," he said, his voice trembling slightly. She turned slowly, her eyes blank and unseeing. Tom felt a surge of panic. He had no idea how to handle this. He took another step forward, reaching out to gently take the knife from her hand. But as he reached for it, her grip tightened further, and she raised the knife slightly. Tom froze, his mind racing. He had read somewhere that waking a sleepwalker could be dangerous, but he had never imagined being in this situation. "Lisa, please," he whispered, his voice cracking. Her eyes flickered for a moment, as if she was struggling to wake up, but then they returned to their vacant stare. She took a step towards him, the knife still raised. Tom's heart pounded in his chest. He had to do something, but he didn't know what. Summoning all his courage, he lunged forward and grabbed her wrist, trying to wrestle the knife from her grip. She struggled against him, her strength surprising him. The knife flashed in the dim light as they grappled, and Tom felt a sharp pain as the blade sliced across his arm. "Lisa, wake up!" he shouted, desperation creeping into his voice. Suddenly, she stopped struggling. Her eyes fluttered and she looked around, confused. The knife slipped from her hand and clattered to the floor. Tom quickly kicked it away and pulled her into his arms, his heart still racing. What happened?" she asked, her voice trembling. "It's okay," Tom said, trying to keep his voice calm. "You were sleepwalking again." Lisa looked down at his arm, where blood was seeping through the cut. "Oh my God, Tom, you're hurt!" "It's just a scratch," he said, though the pain suggested otherwise. "Let's get you back to bed." They went back to bed, but Tom couldn't sleep. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying the night's events over and over. He knew they couldn't ignore this any longer. They needed help. The next day, they made an appointment with a sleep specialist. The doctor listened to their story with a furrowed brow and suggested a sleep study to monitor Lisa's brain activity during the night. He also recommended they lock away any dangerous objects to prevent a repeat of the incident. That night, Tom locked all the knives and sharp objects in a drawer and hid the key. He set up a baby monitor in the bedroom, hoping it would alert him if Lisa started sleepwalking again. But despite his precautions, he couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over him. As the nights passed, Lisa's sleepwalking continued. She would wander the house, her eyes vacant, sometimes mumbling incoherently. Tom followed her each time, making sure she didn't hurt herself or anyone else. But he was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. He couldn't go on like this. One night, he woke to the sound of the baby monitor crackling. He sat up, his heart racing. The screen showed Lisa standing in the kitchen again, but this time she was holding a different knife, a large serrated bread knife he had forgotten to lock away. Tom sprang out of bed and ran to the kitchen. As he reached the doorway, he saw Lisa standing in front of the sink, the knife clutched in her hand. Her eyes were wide open, but they looked different, more aware, almost malevolent. "Lisa," he said, his voice shaking, "put the knife down." She turned to face him, a strange smile spreading across her lips. "Tom," she said, her voice a chilling whisper, "it's time to wake up." Tom felt a surge of fear. This wasn't like the other times. Something was different. He took a step back, his mind racing. He had to get her to put the knife down without getting hurt. "Lisa, please," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Put the knife down and come back to bed." She took a step towards him, the smile never leaving her face. "Wake up, Tom," she whispered again. "Wake up and see." Tom backed away, his heart pounding. He didn't know what to do. He couldn't just leave her there, but he couldn't risk getting closer. As she advanced, the lights in the kitchen flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The air grew colder, and Tom felt a sense of dread wash over him. He realized with a start that this wasn't just sleepwalking. Something else was happening, something he couldn't explain. "Wake up," Lisa whispered one last time, her voice echoing in the cold, dark kitchen. Tom didn't have time to react. She lunged at him, the knife flashing in the dim light. He tried to dodge, but the blade caught him in the side, slicing through his shirt and into his flesh. He cried out in pain, stumbling back. Lisa stood over him, her eyes wide and unblinking. The knife glinted in her hand, dripping with his blood. Tom felt his strength fading, his vision blurring. He tried to crawl away, but his limbs wouldn't respond. As the darkness closed in, he heard Lisa's voice one last time, whispering in his ear. "Wake up, Tom. Wake up and see the truth." Tom's vision faded to black, and the last thing he saw was his wife's blank, unseeing eyes staring down at him, a twisted smile on her lips. The next morning, the police found Lisa wandering the streets, covered in blood and muttering incoherently. She had no memory of what had happened, no explanation for the horror that had unfolded in their home. The doctors said she had suffered a psychotic break, triggered by years of untreated sleepwalking. But Tom knew the truth. As he lay dying on the cold kitchen floor, he had seen something in Lisa's eyes, something dark and ancient, something that had taken hold of her and driven her to madness. And as the life drained from his body, he realized that he had finally woken up to the truth. Some horrors are born of the darkest corners of the human mind, where nightmares take root and grow. And in the end, there is no waking from them, no escape from the shadows that lurk in the depths of our souls. The small town of Willow Creek had always been a quiet, peaceful place. Nestled in a valley surrounded by dense woods, it was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else, and life moved at a leisurely pace. But one summer, something strange began to happen. It started with whispers of sleepwalking, first as idle gossip and then as hushed, fearful conversations. The first incident occurred with old Mrs. Harper. One night, she was found standing in the middle of Maple Street, her eyes wide open but unseeing, her nightgown fluttering in the cool night breeze. Her husband had woken up to find her missing from their bed and had frantically searched the house before finally finding her outside, standing motionless on the road. "Harper, what are you doing?" he had called out, his voice trembling. She had not responded, merely continued to stare blankly ahead. He had to physically guide her back to the house, and even then, she seemed unaware of her surroundings. The next morning, she had no memory of the incident. It was unsettling, but the townspeople wrote it off as an isolated case. However, when more people began to experience similar episodes, the town's sense of unease grew. Each night, more and more residents were found standing in the middle of the roads, their eyes vacant, their expressions eerily calm. Jacob, a young journalist who had recently moved to Willow Creek, decided to investigate the phenomenon. He had always been drawn to the macabre and the mysterious, and this was the most intriguing story he had ever encountered. Armed with a camera and a notebook, he set out to document the strange occurrences. One evening, he set up a watch in his living room, determined to stay awake and see for himself what was happening. Midnight came and went, and Jacob began to feel the weight of sleep pressing down on him. Just as he was about to doze off, he heard a noise outside. He grabbed his camera and cautiously stepped out onto his porch. The sight that greeted him was both surreal and terrifying. Dozens of his neighbors stood in the middle of the road, their eyes open but unseeing, their bodies swaying slightly as if moved by an unseen force. They were of all ages, men, women, and children, all caught in the same trance-like state. Jacob began to take pictures, the flash of his camera lighting up the night. As he moved closer, he noticed something even more disturbing. Each person seemed to be mouthing words, but no sound came out. It was as if they were engaged in some silent collective chant. He approached one of his neighbors, Mr. Williams, and gently shook his shoulder. "Mr. Williams, can you hear me?" he whispered. Mr. Williams did not respond, his eyes remaining fixed on some distant point. Jacob felt a chill run down his spine. He turned to leave, but as he did, he noticed something glinting on the ground. It was a small silver locket, half buried in the dirt. He picked it up, feeling a strange compulsion to keep it. The next day, Jacob tried to talk to his neighbors about what he had seen, but none of them had any memory of the previous night. They were all deeply disturbed by his account and the photographs he showed them, but no one could offer an explanation. As the days passed, Jacob became increasingly obsessed with the locket. It was beautifully crafted, with intricate engravings that he couldn't decipher. He wore it around his neck, feeling a strange sense of comfort and connection to it. But with each passing night, the sleepwalking incidents grew worse. The townspeople began to avoid going out after dark, locking their doors and windows in an attempt to keep whatever force was at work at bay. But it seemed to make no difference. Every night, more and more people were drawn out of their homes, compelled to stand in the middle of the roads. Jacob, too, began to feel the pull. One night, he woke to find himself standing in the middle of Willow Creek Road, the locket clutched tightly in his hand. He had no memory of how he had gotten there. Fear and confusion gripped him, but he knew he had to find answers. Determined to uncover the truth, he began to research the history of Willow Creek. He scoured old newspapers, library archives, and town records, looking for any clue that might explain the strange phenomenon. Finally, he stumbled upon an old journal, hidden away in the attic of the town's historical society. The journal belonged to a woman named Eliza Thompson, who had lived in Willow Creek over a century ago. Her entries detailed a series of strange events remarkably similar to what the town was experiencing now. According to Eliza, the sleepwalking had started shortly after a traveling preacher had come to town, bringing with him a strange artifact, a silver locket. Eliza wrote of how the preacher had conducted secret midnight rituals, claiming to commune with spirits from beyond. The townspeople had been enthralled, but soon after, they began to suffer from terrible nightmares and bouts of sleepwalking. Eliza's final entry was the most chilling. August 15, 1895, the preacher is gone, but the curse remains. Every night we are drawn to the roads, our bodies no longer our own. I fear that we have awakened something that cannot be put to rest. I pray that one day, someone will find a way to break the curse and free us from this torment. Jacob realized with horror that the locket he had found was the same one mentioned in the journal. He knew he had to act quickly if he wanted to save the town and himself. He decided to confront the entity that seemed to be controlling them, to find a way to break the curse. That night, he returned to the spot where he had found the locket, armed with the journal and a sense of determination. As the clock struck midnight, he felt the familiar pull, drawing him out into the road. His neighbors were already there, standing in their trance-like state, their eyes vacant. Holding the locket in one hand and the journal in the other, Jacob began to recite the words from Eliza's final entry. As he spoke, the air around him grew colder, and the whispers grew louder. The townspeople began to move, their bodies swaying in unison as if guided by an unseen force. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the darkness, a tall, shadowy form with glowing eyes. The entity moved towards Jacob, its presence overwhelming and suffocating. "You seek to break the curse," it hissed, its voice echoing in his mind. Jacob stood his ground, his heart pounding. "Yes, I do. These people deserve to be free." The entity laughed, a chilling sound that sent shivers down his spine. "You cannot break what has been bound for so long. The locket holds their souls, and through it they are mine." Desperate, Jacob clutched the locket and shouted, "Eliza Thompson, if you can hear me, help us break this curse." The locket grew warm in his hand, and a blinding light erupted from it, engulfing the entity. The townspeople collapsed to the ground, their bodies free from the entity's control. The shadowy form writhed in agony, its screams piercing the night. But as the light faded, Jacob realized the true cost of breaking the curse. The locket shattered, and the entity, though weakened, was not destroyed. It lunged at Jacob, its cold grip wrapping around him. "You may have freed them," it snarled, "but you will take their place." Jacob felt his body go numb as the entity's power coursed through him. His vision blurred, and the last thing he saw was the faces of his neighbors, their eyes filled with a mixture of relief and horror. When the sun rose the next morning, the people of Willow Creek woke to find themselves safe in their homes. The curse had been lifted, but Jacob was gone. The townspeople mourned his loss, grateful for his sacrifice, but haunted by the memory of what had transpired. And on quiet nights, when the wind whispered through the trees, they could still feel the lingering presence of the entity, waiting for the day when it would once again claim the souls of the innocent. The first time it happened, Sarah and Tom dismissed it as a typical childhood oddity. Their 7-year-old son, Daniel, had always been a deep sleeper, prone to vivid dreams and the occasional bout of sleepwalking. So when they found him standing at the foot of their bed one night, his eyes open but unseeing, they gently guided him back to his room without much thought. "He's just sleepwalking," Tom reassured Sarah as they settled back into bed. "It's nothing to worry about." Sarah nodded, though she couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered in the pit of her stomach. Daniel had stood there for what felt like an eternity, his small frame silhouetted against the moonlight streaming in through the window. It wasn't just that he was sleepwalking. It was the way he had stared at the closet door, as if something inside had captured his attention. Over the next few weeks, Daniel's sleepwalking episodes became more frequent. Each time, Sarah and Tom would wake to find him standing in their room, his gaze fixed on the closet. They tried to talk to him about it during the day, but he had no memory of his nocturnal wanderings. "It's probably just a phase," the pediatrician said when Sarah mentioned it during a routine checkup. "Kids go through all sorts of strange behaviors. He'll grow out of it." But Sarah wasn't convinced. There was something deeply unsettling about the way Daniel stared at the closet, his expression vacant and yet somehow intent. She began to dread the nights, lying awake and listening for the sound of his footsteps padding down the hallway. One particularly stormy night, Sarah woke with a start to find Daniel standing at the foot of the bed again. His eyes were wide open, and he was staring directly at the closet door. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and a flash of lightning illuminated his pale face. "Daniel," Sarah whispered, reaching out to him. "Honey, go back to bed." But Daniel didn't move. He stood there, as if rooted to the spot, his gaze never wavering from the closet. Sarah glanced at Tom, who was still asleep, then got out of bed and walked over to Daniel. She gently took his hand and tried to lead him back to his room, but he resisted, pulling away from her grasp. "Mommy," he said softly, his voice tinged with fear. "There's something in the closet." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Daniel looked up at her, his eyes filling with tears. "It's watching me. It wants to come out." A A sense of dread settled over Sarah, and she turned to look at the closet. It was just an ordinary closet, filled with clothes and shoes and the detritus of daily life. But in that moment, it seemed to loom larger, the darkness within it impenetrable. She shook her head, trying to dispel the irrational fear that had taken hold of her. "There's nothing in the closet, Daniel. You're just having a bad dream." But Daniel shook his head vehemently. "No, Mommy, it's real. It's in there." Sarah led Daniel back to his room, tucked him into bed, and sat with him until he fell asleep. She returned to her own room, her mind racing. What if Daniel was right? What if there really was something in the closet? The next day, Sarah decided to investigate. She emptied the closet, checking every nook and cranny for any signs of something unusual. She found nothing out of the ordinary, but the sense of unease remained. That night, she and Tom decided to keep the closet door closed, hoping it might help ease Daniel's fears. They explained to him that the closet was just a closet, and there was nothing inside that could hurt him. Daniel seemed reassured, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. A few nights later, Sarah woke to the sound of Daniel's voice. She turned on the bedside lamp and saw him standing at the foot of the bed, staring at the closed closet door. His eyes were wide with fear, and he was whispering something under his breath. "Daniel," she said softly, trying not to wake Tom. "What's wrong?" Daniel looked at her, his expression terrified. "It's in the closet, Mommy. It's trying to get out." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She got out of bed and walked over to the closet, her hands trembling. She reached for the doorknob, hesitating for a moment before pulling the door open. The closet was empty. She turned back to Daniel, who was now crying softly. She knelt down beside him and hugged him tightly. "There's nothing there, sweetheart. It's just your imagination." But Daniel continued to cry, his small body shaking with sobs. "It's hiding, Mommy. It's waiting for you to leave." Sarah felt a cold knot of fear tighten in her stomach. She didn't know what to do. She couldn't keep living like this, with her son terrified of something that didn't exist. That night, after Daniel had finally fallen asleep, Sarah and Tom discussed what to do. They decided to take Daniel to a child psychologist, hoping that professional help might ease his fears. The psychologist was kind and patient, and over the next few weeks, Daniel seemed to improve. He stopped sleepwalking, and the nightmares became less frequent. Sarah began to hope that the worst was over. But one night, just as she was drifting off to sleep, she heard the sound of footsteps in the hallway. She sat up, her heart pounding, and saw Daniel standing in the doorway, his eyes wide and vacant. "Daniel," she whispered, getting out of bed. "What's wrong?" He didn't respond, just turned and walked down the hallway towards his room. Sarah followed him, feeling a sense of dread settle over her. When she reached his room, she found him standing in front of his own closet, the door slightly ajar. "Daniel, go back to bed," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. But Daniel didn't move. He reached out and slowly opened the closet door. Inside it was dark, the shadows deep and impenetrable. "Mommy," he said softly, his voice trembling, "it's in there." Sarah's heart raced. She stepped forward, peering into the darkness. She saw nothing, but the air seemed to grow colder, and she felt a sense of foreboding wash over her. "There's nothing there, Daniel," she said, trying to convince herself as much as him. But Daniel shook his head. "It's hiding. It's waiting." Sarah didn't know what to do. She closed the closet door and led Daniel back to his bed, tucking him in and sitting with him until he fell asleep. The next day, Sarah decided to call in a priest to bless the house. She wasn't particularly religious, but she was willing to try anything to help her son. The priest came and performed the blessing, sprinkling holy water in each room and saying prayers to cleanse the house. For a while, things seemed to improve. Daniel stopped talking about the closet, and the sleepwalking episodes ceased. Sarah began to relax, thinking that perhaps the blessing had worked. But one night, just as she and Tom were getting ready for bed, they heard a noise from Daniel's room. It was a low, guttural growl, unlike anything they had ever heard before. They rushed to his room, throwing open the door. Daniel was standing in front of the closet, the door wide open. His eyes were wide and vacant, his face pale. Inside the closet, they could see a dark, shadowy figure, its eyes glowing red in the darkness. "Daniel!" Sarah screamed, rushing forward to grab him. But the figure moved faster. It reached out and grabbed Daniel, pulling him into the closet. The door slammed shut with a force that shook the room. Sarah and Tom pounded on the door, screaming Daniel's name. But there was no response. They tore the door open, but the closet was empty. Daniel was gone. They searched the house, the yard, the entire neighborhood, but there was no sign of him. The police were called, and a massive search was launched, but Daniel was never found. The house felt empty and cold without him. Sarah and Tom were consumed with grief and guilt, unable to understand what had happened. They moved away, unable to bear living in the house that had taken their son. But no matter where they went, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, waiting for the right moment to strike. And at night, in the silence of their new home, she could still hear Daniel's voice, whispering from the darkness. "It's hiding, Mommy. It's waiting for you." When I woke up, the first thing I noticed was the stark, blinding light overhead. I blinked several times, trying to adjust my eyes to the harsh fluorescent glow. The light flickered intermittently, casting eerie shadows that danced on the walls. As my vision cleared, I realized I was in a hospital bed, but the room was eerily silent and devoid of any other presence. I sat up slowly, my head throbbing with a dull ache. The room was cold, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes you shiver uncontrollably. I looked around, trying to make sense of my surroundings. The walls were a sterile white, the paint peeling in some places. Medical equipment stood silent and still, their displays dark. A sense of unease settled over me as I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood up. My feet were bare, and the tile floor was icy against my skin. I took a deep breath and stepped towards the door, my footsteps echoing in the empty room. The hallway outside was just as deserted. The lights flickered sporadically, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to move on their own. I called out, hoping for a response, but my voice echoed back to me, the only reply in the oppressive silence. I began to walk down the hallway, my heart pounding with each step. Every door I passed was closed, and when I tried the handles, they were all locked. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional flicker and buzz of the overhead lights. As I made my way through the labyrinthine corridors, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced over my shoulder several times, but the hallway remained empty. I turned a corner and found myself in front of the nurse's station. The desk was cluttered with papers and medical supplies, but there was no sign of anyone. I picked up a phone on the desk and pressed it to my ear, but there was no dial tone, just an ominous silence. I slammed it down, frustration and fear mounting within me. I needed to find someone, anyone, who could tell me what was happening. I continued down the hall, my steps quickening. The oppressive silence was broken by a distant sound, a faint, rhythmic beeping. I followed it, the sound growing louder and more distinct with each step. It led me to a set of double doors, slightly ajar. I pushed them open and stepped inside. The room beyond was a large ward, filled with rows of empty beds. The beeping was coming from a heart monitor attached to the only occupied bed in the room. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. Lying in the bed was a woman, her face pale and gaunt. Her eyes were closed, and she looked almost peaceful, except for the deep, angry gash on her forehead. The heart monitor beeped steadily, but the line on the screen was flat, indicating no heartbeat. I stared in horror, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. How could the monitor be beeping if the woman was dead? I backed away slowly, my mind racing. The lights flickered again, and the room seemed to grow colder. I turned to leave, but the double doors slammed shut with a deafening bang. I rushed to the doors and tried to open them, but they wouldn't budge. Panic surged through me as I pounded on the doors, shouting for help. The lights flickered once more, and the beeping from the heart monitor stopped abruptly. I turned back to the woman in the bed, and my blood ran cold. Her eyes were open, staring directly at me, and her mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile. I stumbled back, my heart racing. The woman's eyes followed me, and I could hear a faint whispering sound, like a dozen voices speaking at once. The temperature in the room plummeted, and my breath came out in visible puffs. I turned back to the doors, desperate to escape. My hands shook as I fumbled with the handle, but it remained stubbornly locked. The whispering grew louder, and I could feel a presence behind me, something cold and dark. I spun around, pressing my back against the door. The woman in the bed was sitting up now, her eyes fixed on me. The whispering voices seemed to emanate from her, filling the room with a sense of dread. I had to get out of there, but there was nowhere to go. Suddenly, the lights went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. The whispering stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder, and I screamed, thrashing against the door. The lights flickered back on, and the woman was standing right in front of me, her face inches from mine. Her eyes were empty, hollow pits, and her breath was like a cold wind against my skin. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice a chilling echo. I pushed past her, my fear giving me strength. The doors finally gave way, and I stumbled into the hallway, my heart pounding. I ran, not caring where I was going, just needing to get away. The hallways twisted and turned, the flickering lights casting eerie shadows. I could hear footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate, keeping pace with my frantic run. I didn't dare look back. I rounded a corner and skidded to a halt. In front of me was another set of double doors, but these were open, leading into a stairwell. I took the stairs two at a time, the sound of footsteps growing louder behind me. I burst through a door at the bottom of the stairs and found myself in the basement. The air was damp and musty, and the lights were dim and flickering. I could hear the hum of machinery, but the place seemed deserted. I ran down the corridor, my footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. I passed storage rooms and maintenance closets, all empty. The sense of being watched was overwhelming, and I knew I wasn't alone. I turned a corner and came face to face with a figure in a dark hooded cloak. Their face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel their eyes on me. I backed away slowly, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The figure stepped forward, and I turned to run, but the corridor behind me was blocked by another figure. They advanced slowly, and I was trapped between them. I pressed my back against the wall, my heart racing. The figures closed in, their presence suffocating. The lights flickered and went out, plunging the basement into darkness. I felt cold hands grab my arms, and I screamed, struggling against their grip. The whispering voices filled my ears, and I could feel the darkness closing in around me. When the lights flickered back on, I was alone. The figures were gone, but their presence lingered, a cold, oppressive weight on my chest. I stumbled down the corridor, desperate to find a way out. At the end of the hallway, I found a door marked Exit. I pushed it open and stepped into the cold night air, my breath coming in visible puffs. I was outside, but the sense of dread remained. I looked back at the hospital, its windows dark and empty. The flickering lights cast eerie shadows, and I knew I would never be free of what I had seen. I walked away, my mind numb with fear. The hospital had changed me, and I knew I would never be the same. The darkness had followed me, and there was no escape. The whispers still echoed in my mind, a haunting reminder of the terror that awaited within those walls. The basement had always been a place of mystery in my old family home. It was a large, musty space filled with the accumulated belongings of several generations, a labyrinth of boxes and forgotten relics. I had spent countless hours down there as a child, exploring and imagining what secrets might be hidden away. But now, as an adult, the basement seemed more foreboding than fascinating. One stormy evening, when the power went out, I decided to finally tackle the job of cleaning it up. Armed with a flashlight and a determination to make some sense of the chaos, I descended the creaky wooden stairs into the gloom. The beam of my flashlight cut through the dust-laden air, revealing stacks of old furniture, trunks, and shelves lined with jars of preserved foods long past their prime. As I began sorting through the boxes, I came across a small, leather-bound diary, its cover worn and cracked with age. It had a lock, but the clasp was broken, allowing the book to open easily. Intrigued, I sat down on an old wooden crate and began to read. The diary belonged to a girl named Eliza, who had lived in the house over a century ago. Her handwriting was elegant, and her entries were filled with the details of her daily life, her hopes, and her fears. The more I read, the more engrossed I became. Eliza wrote about her strict parents, her longing for freedom, and the strange occurrences that began to plague the house. As I turned the pages, the entries grew darker. Eliza wrote about hearing whispers at night, about doors slamming shut on their own, and about the feeling of being watched. Her fear was palpable, and I could almost feel her desperation seeping through the pages. One entry in particular caught my attention. It was dated October 13, 1912. The whispers are getting louder. Last night, I woke to the sound of my bedroom door slamming shut. When I got up to investigate, I found the basement door open, a cold draft blowing up from below. I know something is down there, something that wants to be found, but I am too afraid to go. A chill ran down my spine as I read her words. The basement door had been open when I came down tonight, too. I dismissed the thought as a coincidence and continued reading, but the unease lingered. Hours passed, and I lost track of time. The storm raged on outside, and the basement seemed to grow colder with each passing minute. I was deep into the diary when I heard it, the sound of a door slamming shut. The noise echoed through the basement, making me jump. I stood up, my heart pounding, and shone my flashlight around the room. Everything seemed in place, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone. Deciding I had done enough for one night, I placed the diary on a nearby shelf and made my way back upstairs. As I reached the top of the stairs, the basement door slammed shut behind me with a force that rattled the walls. I spun around, but there was no one there. My hands trembled as I turned the knob, but the door was stuck fast. Panic set in, and I pounded on the door, shouting for help. The house was silent except for the storm outside. I took a deep breath and forced myself to calm down. After a few minutes of struggling, I managed to wrench the door open. I hurried to my bedroom, locking the door behind me. Exhausted and unnerved, I eventually fell into a restless sleep. The next few days were uneventful, but I couldn't stop thinking about Eliza's diary and the strange occurrences in the basement. One night, as I was lying in bed, I heard the unmistakable sound of the basement door creaking open. My blood ran cold, and I listened intently. The house was silent, but the feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever. Gathering my courage, I grabbed my flashlight and made my way downstairs. The basement door was ajar, just as I had feared. I pushed it open and descended the stairs, the beam of my flashlight slicing through the darkness. The diary was still on the shelf where I had left it. I picked it up and continued reading, hoping to find some answers. Eliza's final entries were frantic, filled with terror and confusion. She wrote about waking up to find herself standing at the basement door, about hearing her name whispered in the dead of night. Her last entry was dated November 1st, 1912. I can no longer tell what is real and what is a dream. The whispers are constant, and the doors slam shut of their own accord. I fear I am losing my mind. I do not know what it wants from me, but I am too afraid to find out. The entry ended abruptly, the final words scrawled hastily across the page. As I read, a cold draft swept through the basement, extinguishing my flashlight. I was plunged into darkness, and the sense of being watched intensified. I fumbled with the flashlight, my hands shaking, but it wouldn't turn back on. I felt a presence behind me, cold and oppressive. My breath came in short, panicked gasps as I backed towards the stairs. Suddenly, the basement door slammed shut again, trapping me in the darkness. I pounded on the door, shouting for help, but my cries were swallowed by the darkness. The whispers began, soft at first, then growing louder, surrounding me. I could feel something closing in, a cold hand brushing against my arm. I screamed and scrambled up the stairs, throwing myself against the door. It flew open, and I stumbled into the hallway, slamming it shut behind me. I didn't sleep that night. The whispers continued, just beyond the door, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurked below. I knew I had to get out of the house, to leave and never return. But as I packed my bags, I found the diary on my bed, open to a blank page. A single sentence was written in the same elegant handwriting: "You cannot escape." The door to my bedroom slammed shut, and the whispers filled the room. I realized then that the darkness had followed me. that there was no escape from the terror that had claimed Eliza and now sought to claim me. As the whispers grew louder, I knew that I was not alone, and that the horror of the basement had only just begun. The doors slammed shut, trapping me in the darkness, and the whispers promised that I would never leave. It was supposed to be a perfect weekend getaway. My friends and I had planned the camping trip for months, eagerly anticipating the chance to escape the city and immerse ourselves in nature. We chose a secluded spot in the forest, far from any trails or other campers. The idea was to be completely alone, surrounded by nothing but trees and the sounds of the wilderness. There were 5 of us. Mark, the fearless leader of our group; Lisa, his girlfriend, who was always up for an adventure; Chris, the jokester who kept us all laughing; Sarah, the quiet one who loved nature; and me, the planner who made sure we had everything we needed. We arrived at the campsite late in the afternoon, the sun beginning its descent behind the trees. The air was crisp and cool, filled with the earthy scent of pine and damp leaves. We set up our tents in a small clearing, gathered wood for a fire, and settled in for the night. As darkness fell, we sat around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. The fire crackled and popped, casting flickering shadows that danced among the trees. It felt like we were in our own little world, far from the stresses of everyday life. Around midnight, we decided to call it a night. One by one, we retreated to our tents, the fire reduced to glowing embers. The forest was silent, except for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of an owl. I fell asleep quickly, the sound of the forest lulling me into a deep slumber. I woke suddenly in the middle of the night, my heart pounding. Something had jolted me awake, but I wasn't sure what. I lay still, listening intently. The forest was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt unnatural. I unzipped my tent and peered out into the darkness. The moonlight cast a pale glow over the campsite, but everything seemed in order. I was about to crawl back into my tent when I noticed that Mark's tent was open, the flap fluttering slightly in the breeze. I called out his name softly, but there was no response. Concerned, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out into the clearing. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but there was no sign of Mark. I woke Chris and Sarah, explaining that Mark was missing. Together, we searched the surrounding area, our calls echoing through the trees. Lisa woke up too and joined us, her face pale with worry. But there was no sign of Mark. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. We huddled together, trying to make sense of what had happened. Mark was an experienced camper. He wouldn't have wandered off without telling anyone. We decided to wait until morning before panicking, hoping that he would return on his own. As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, we resumed our search. The forest seemed different in the daylight, less menacing, but still filled with an uneasy sense of foreboding. We scoured the area for hours, but there was no trace of Mark. By afternoon, we were exhausted and scared. We returned to the campsite, hoping to regroup and come up with a plan. But when we arrived, we found that Lisa was gone too. Her tent was open, her belongings scattered, as if she had left in a hurry. Panic set in. 2 of our friends had disappeared without a trace, and we had no idea what was happening. Chris suggested we pack up and leave immediately, but Sarah insisted we stay and search for them. Reluctantly, we agreed to stay one more night, but we decided to keep watch in shifts. That night, the atmosphere was tense. The fire burned low, and every rustle of leaves sent us into high alert. Chris took the first watch while Sarah and I tried to get some sleep. But sleep was elusive, my mind racing with fear and uncertainty. I must have dozed off at some point because I woke to the sound of Chris shouting. I scrambled out of my tent, heart pounding. Chris was standing at the edge of the clearing, flashlight beam darting through the trees. "Sarah's gone!" he shouted, his voice tinged with panic. I rushed to Sarah's tent, finding it empty. Just like Mark and Lisa, she had vanished without a trace. Chris and I stood there, fear gripping us. We were alone in the middle of the forest, with no idea what was happening to our friends. "We need to leave," Chris said, his voice trembling. "We can't stay here." I agreed. We quickly packed up our gear, our movements frantic and hurried. As we worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something was lurking just beyond the circle of light from our fire. With our packs on our backs, we set off into the forest, following the path that had brought us here. The darkness seemed to close in around us, the trees pressing in from all sides. The flashlight beams cut through the blackness, but it felt like we were walking into a void. We hadn't gone far when we heard it, a soft, whispering sound like voices carried on the wind. We stopped, straining to listen. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I realized they were coming from all around us. Panic surged through me. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Chris's arm. We sprinted through the forest, branches whipping at our faces, the whispers following us. The path seemed to twist and turn, leading us deeper into the darkness. I glanced over my shoulder, but Chris was no longer behind me. I stopped, calling his name, but there was no answer. I was alone. My friends had all disappeared, and now I was lost in the forest, the whispers growing louder, more menacing. I stumbled forward, tears streaming down my face, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Finally, I broke through the trees and into a small clearing. In the center stood an old, dilapidated cabin, its windows dark and foreboding. I hesitated, but the whispers were closing in, and I had nowhere else to go. I pushed open the door and stepped inside, the floorboards creaking under my weight. The cabin was empty, save for a few pieces of broken furniture and a cold, damp chill that seeped into my bones. As I stood there, trying to catch my breath, I heard a soft, familiar voice. "Help me." I turned, my heart leaping into my throat. It was Sarah, standing in the doorway, her eyes wide with fear. She beckoned to me, her voice trembling. "Please, help me." I rushed to her, relief flooding through me. But as I reached out to touch her, she vanished, her form dissolving into the darkness. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. The whispers grew louder, filling the cabin with their insidious presence. I realized then that I was trapped. There was no escape from the forest, no way to save my friends. The darkness had claimed them, and now it was coming for me. The last thing I heard before the darkness swallowed me was the sound of the whispers, cold and unforgiving, promising that I would never leave. And then, there was only silence. The fog was so thick that night, it felt like driving through a cloud. My headlights barely cut through the dense, swirling mist, illuminating only a few feet ahead of me. The road was deserted, and an eerie silence hung in the air, broken only by the soft hum of my car's engine. I was returning from a late business meeting in a town I rarely visited. The unfamiliar roads twisted and turned through dense woods, and the fog made everything look the same. Every tree, every curve in the road seemed to blend into one continuous, disorienting landscape. I could feel the tension in my shoulders as I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white. I was just starting to wonder if I had taken a wrong turn when I saw something up ahead. A small figure standing by the side of the road, barely visible through the fog. As I drew closer, my heart began to race. It was a child, a young girl, standing alone in the middle of nowhere. I pulled over and rolled down the window, the cold, damp air rushing into the car. "Hey there," I called out. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The girl didn't respond. She just stood there staring at me with wide, frightened eyes. She couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old, her clothes thin and worn. I felt a pang of concern. What was she doing out here all alone in this weather? I opened the door and stepped out, my breath forming clouds in the chilly air. "It's not safe out here," I said gently. "Why don't you come with me? I'll take you somewhere safe." The girl hesitated for a moment, then nodded slowly. She climbed into the passenger seat, and I closed the door behind her. As I got back into the driver's seat, I noticed she was shivering. I turned up the heat and offered her my jacket, which she accepted with a shy nod. "What's your name?" I asked as I pulled back onto the road, driving slowly through the fog. She replied in a small voice, "Nice to meet you, Emily. My name's John. Do you know where your parents are?" She shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "I don't know. I got lost." I felt a surge of protectiveness. "Don't worry, Emily. We'll find them. I'll take you to the nearest town, and we'll call for help." As we drove, I tried to make conversation to keep her calm, but she remained quiet, staring out the window into the fog. I kept glancing at her, feeling an unease that I couldn't quite place. There was something about her silence, the way she clutched my jacket tightly around her, that sent chills down my spine. After what felt like hours, we reached a small town. The streets were empty, the shops closed, and the fog still hung heavy in the air. I pulled into a gas station, relieved to see it was open. I parked the car and turned to Emily. "Stay here, okay? I'm gonna go inside and get some help." She nodded, her eyes wide with fear. I stepped out of the car and walked into the gas station, the bell above the door jingling as I entered. The clerk looked up from his magazine, his expression bored. "Can I help you?" he asked. "Yeah, I found this girl on the side of the road," I said, pointing to my car. "She's lost and needs help finding her parents. Can you call the police or something?" The clerk's eyes widened and he stood up, glancing out the window. "What girl?" I turned to look and my heart nearly stopped. The passenger seat was empty. Emily was gone. I rushed back outside, my mind racing. The fog had thickened even more, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. "Emily!" I called out, my voice echoing in the silence. "Emily, where are you?" There was no response, only the oppressive stillness of the fog. Panic set in, and I began to search the area, calling her name. I checked behind the gas station, in the nearby alleyways, but she was nowhere to be found. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. I returned to the gas station, my heart pounding. The clerk looked at me with a mix of confusion and concern. "Are you sure you had a girl with you?" he asked. "Yes, she was right here," I insisted, feeling the frustration and fear rising. "Her name was Emily. She said she was lost." The clerk shook his head. "I didn't see anyone, man. Maybe you should sit down for a bit. You look like you've seen a ghost." I sank into a chair, my mind reeling. Had I imagined it? No, that was impossible. I had seen her, talked to her. She had been real. As I sat there trying to make sense of what had happened, an old man entered the gas station. He glanced at me, then did a double take. His face went pale, and he hurried over. "Did you say you found a girl named Emily?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Yes," I replied, "but she disappeared. Do you know her?" The old man nodded, his eyes wide with fear. "Emily Harper. She went missing 10 years ago, right around this time of year. They never found her." My blood ran cold. "But I just saw her. She was right here." The old man shook his head. "Many people have seen her, always on nights like this when the fog is thick. They say she's still looking for her parents, still lost." I felt a chill run down my spine. Had I really seen a ghost? It seemed impossible, but the fear and confusion in the old man's eyes told me otherwise. I thanked the clerk and the old man and left the gas station, my mind racing. As I drove away, the fog began to lift, revealing the dark, empty road ahead. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been part of something beyond my understanding, something that defied explanation. The rest of the drive home was a blur. When I finally reached my house, I was exhausted and shaken. I parked the car and sat there for a moment, trying to process what had happened. As I stepped out of the car, I glanced at the passenger seat and saw my jacket lying there, neatly folded. On top of it was a small, worn-out doll, the kind a young girl might cherish. I picked it up, my hands trembling. The air grew cold, and the fog began to swirl around me again. I looked up and saw Emily standing at the end of my driveway, her eyes sad and filled with longing. She raised her hand as if to wave, then slowly faded into the mist. I stood there, clutching the doll, my heart heavy with sorrow. Emily was gone, but her presence lingered, a haunting reminder of the girl who was forever lost in the fog. And I knew, deep down, that I would never forget her, nor the night I met the ghost of Emily Harper.